the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. Today on the show, we commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day with two writers of Holocaust fiction when I visit with New York Times bestsellers Pam Jenoff, author of The Orphan's Tale, and Jessica Shattuck, author of The Women in the Castle, who, by the way, recently wrote an astonishing New York Times op-ed piece, My Grandparents Were Nazis. Let's get to it. For author Pam Jenoff, it all began with the astonishing success of her The Commandant's Girl, the World War II heartwrenching Quill-nominated International Bestseller. 9 books later, Jenoff comes to us with her new title, The Orphan's Tale, her first to make it onto the New York Times Bestseller List. There have been countless agonizing stories from the pages of the Second World War, but in The Orphan's Tale, Jenoff has found a fresh way to bring this history-changing period to life. Set amid the unconventional world of a traveling circus, the novel brings together two women, both refugees from their own pasts and each attempting to live under the radar during the Nazi incursion. Forming an at first tentative bond, the two resilient women learn to trust and rely on each other, even as the threat of exposure closes in. Drawing on a little-known, real-life, Nazi-run program, the Lebensborn Program, in which Jewish babies were ripped from their families and sent by train to concentration camps, and the circuses of the era that sheltered Jews during the war, The Orphan's Tale exposes the light in the shadows of World War II and is a tribute to the human spirit that soars in the midst of epic despair. Let's talk. Pam, always nice to have you back on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show.
Thank you.
I'm surprised. I swear, I think more than anybody else, you're the one who's been on the most. It's extraordinary, but hey, that's because I love your work. So here we are. My old friend, New York Times Bestseller List. How exciting is that?
Thank you. I say it's like an overnight success, 10 years in the making, right? It was 10 years to the day since my first book came out.
Is that true?
True.
Oh, my gosh. How did that feel?
Unexpected. I always say I can't hit the bestseller list with a baseball bat, but I had a great team behind this book. And more importantly than that is I'm just gratified at how well The Orphan's Tale has been received by readers.
And for good reason. We're going to talk about the book in a minute, but I want to say this to you. It has been a journey from The Commandant's Girl. 7 titles altogether, I think now. This is
actually 9. I get a little confused, but actually 9.
Okay, so 9 titles. That's impressive, right? That's a lot of storytelling, a lot of words, a lot of research, a whole lot of history. What's one of the most important thing as a writer you've learned through this journey you've been on? It's been quite a journey.
The historical research piece, I just have to say, is fascinating. I was sitting next to an author of what we might call modern women's fiction on a panel, and she said, I just kind of start writing. And I did a double take, and I looked at her, like, really? Because historical research, there's sort of a whole other job built in there when you're writing historical fiction. But I think that over the years, I've learned, I think readers' expectations have just gotten higher with respect to the historical accuracy as well as the story that's being told. And I feel a great sense of obligation, and always have, to the people and the places I'm depicting in my work, when I'm writing a book. And that is nothing new, but it's just become increased and enhanced over the decade.
What about what you learned about humanity? I mean, at the backdrop of so much of what you do write about is the horror of Nazi Germany, World War II, when the worst of humanity raised its ugly head.
Yeah, so one of my key themes is really exploring the gray areas in people. So as you know, I was sent to Poland as a diplomat over 20 years ago to work on Holocaust issues when I found myself there at a moment in time that those issues were still very much present. And through those experiences, I was moved and changed, and I really learned that the history was just much more nuanced and complex than I had learned as a girl growing up in the United States. And so one of the things I try and do in my books is show the gray areas in people. My Jewish characters are flawed. My German officers are human. And my ordinary people on the street are everywhere in between. And that's something that I feel very personally about. More globally with the theme, It's just so interesting that many of the themes I write about, particularly in The Orphan's Tale, which has to do with refuge and sanctuary and our moral responsibility to help others, have just become so very prevalent again today.
The backdrop of The Orphan's Tale. Two little-known bits of history. Let's start with, I'll say it's the Lebensborn Program. In the author's note, you say the unknown children. Take it from there. Give us some background.
Yes, so The Orphan's Tale was inspired by two true stories that I discovered while researching in the virtual archives of Yad Vashem. There's a database called the Database of the Righteous, and those are people who are known to have helped during the war and saved lives. So the first of those stories is a horrific tale, and it was something called The Train of Unknown Children, and it was a boxcar of babies headed to a concentration camp, awfully, too young to know their own names because they had been taken from their parents. The other story which inspired The Orphan's Tale is the story of the rescuer circus. And this was a story I had never heard for all of my years of working with the war and the Holocaust. And this was a true story of a German circus that had rescued Jews. And so I combined both of these in writing The Orphan's Tale.
The circus story, phenomenal. A number of things I want to go, little rat holes I want to go down with. First of all, one thing is I didn't know that there was such a thing as a Jewish circus. That just doesn't compute for me somehow. I don't know whether Jews own circuses. But then I even found out Barnum and Bailey, which just went belly up, under. That was at one point for about 60 years owned by Jews. It's not totally your story, but I just thought I'd throw that in because, you learn something new every day, right?
Correct. So two things about that. When I first found the story of this German circus that had rescued Jews and I started researching circuses, I literally, in the library that I use, found a book called Jewish People in German Popular Entertainment or some such thing. I'm paraphrasing. And it was a history from about the mid-1800s through World War II. And there was an entire chapter of this book dedicated to German circus, Jewish circus dynasties in Europe, if you will. And so there were these families. Blumenfeld was one, and there were various families that had maybe 12 or 13 children and multiple circuses, and they'd gone on for years and years as sort of these Jewish circus dynasties. That by the end of World War II were, virtually no longer in existence. Now, it's fascinating that you mentioned Ringling Brothers, because when we look at the collapse of these circus dynasties in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, and then we look at the collapse of Ringling Brothers, present day, I do think there are a lot of parallels in the kinds of events that led up to the ultimate demise, world events weakening the circuses, and then people turning to other forms of popular entertainment and drawing the crowds away from the circuses. So a lot of interesting parallels.
And here is the other one. It's a line that's in your book, and it really got me to thinking, because, the circus is about oddity, weirdness, strange, everything that Hitler was trying to wipe out, all of the creativity that he wanted to just, eliminate. And yet this becomes the center of your book. Wow, fascinating. The dichotomy,
well,
right?
There's an actual quote from the real circus owner who sheltered Jews, the German man who did this out of the goodness of his heart. And he said, "We circus folks see no difference as to race or religion." And I just thought that was such a powerful quote.
Absolutely, totally. The scenes in this book, I'm thinking, you do all this research with your eyes and your head, right? And then you've got this scene when one character's trying to teach the other how to do the high wire fly. And I'm like, now, how did you write that? Did you go out and try that? Did you watch somebody teaching that, or you just did that out of your brain? Well done.
Thank you. So the storyline that necessitated this sort of research is that, Noah is this young Dutch girl who has rescued one of the unknown children from the train, and she finds shelter with this German circus. But in order to stay, she has to become part of the act. And the circus director says, "You will become part of the flying trapeze and act." And he tasks this older aerialist, Astrid, who's from a German Jewish circus family, to teach Noah the flying trapeze, which is not an easy thing to do because Noah, although she has some gymnastics background, she's 16 and she's never been on a trapeze. So my research was sort of all over the place. I started with circuses, and I don't love circuses. Like, I wasn't sure I wanted to spend a year writing about the circus, but I gained deep respect for the artistry and the thought that goes into how the tent was set up and how the seats were put and what order they sequenced the acts. A lot of artistry in the circus. Then I had to get into the actual flying trapeze. I did not fly. No authors were harmed in the making of this book. But I had an aerialist on retainer, and by on retainer, I mean she was helping me for free. And this aerialist would answer my questions, but it wasn't until very far along in the writing of this book that I even knew what questions I wanted to ask. So things like, could you throw someone to this perch, or how many people would it take to do such and such act? And so in constructing the routines, I was very cautious that Noah, the one who's just barely learning the act, I didn't have her doing anything so crazy. She was doing sort of the bare minimum, the simple moves. And then Astrid, who was throwing her, if you will, was the one who was sort of making it look good.
It's phenomenal writing, and it really, it gets you going when you're reading about it. Maybe we should have started with, so Astrid, Noah, two women who come together in the circus. Give us a little of the background of the story so people want to read the book.
Sure. So Noah comes to the circus. Noah's a young 16-year-old girl who's been kicked out by her own parents. She's Dutch, and she became pregnant by a German soldier. They kicked her out. She was forced to give up her child, and she's living in this pity circumstances, above a German rail station, cleaning the station to earn her keep, when she discovers this boxcar full of babies. And in a moment of fateful impulse, she takes one of the babies and flees into the night. The circus, she finds the circus, and they shelter her. But Astrid, who is tasked to teach her the flying trapeze, to teach Noah, is none too happy about it. Now, Astrid, interestingly, is about going on 40 years old. She came from a Jewish circus family, which she left to marry a German officer and live in Berlin years earlier. And when the war broke out, this is also inspired by a bit of true history, the German officers were ordered to divorce their Jewish wives. And so Astrid's husband has cast her out. Her own circus family is decimated and gone, and Astrid is a Jew in hiding with this German circus. Now, she doesn't like Noah. She doesn't think Noah can do the trapeze act. She thinks Noah brings unwanted attention to the circus, and she doesn't believe the story that Noah is telling. So this book is ultimately about the friendship between these two very different women and whether they can save each other or whether their secrets will destroy them both.
It's a great tale, and it's a great tale of friendship and women friendship. And, there's so many people who, go, women can't be friends. Now, you and I share a lot of friends. Yes, women can be great friends. But about writing about women friendship, something you do a lot, by the way. Talk to me about women and writing women friendships and what you know about women friendships.
Well, even before I get to the friendships themselves, what I enjoy about writing women in historical fiction is you take a woman who, through ordinary circumstances, would have had her feet set on a very certain path in life. But because of war or other catastrophe, she's thrown off that path into circumstances that are completely unfamiliar, that she never would have seen otherwise, and that she's generally unequipped to deal with. And so for me, the real joy is seeing how those women grow and change in those alternate circumstances. And with respect to the friendship, it's not just about friendship. I would say one of the themes in this book is really finding home in the least likely of places. So it's really about their friendship, but set in this broader context of the eclectic group that is the circus.
I like that a lot, finding home in different places than you would think that you would find home. And I think that a lot of us live that kind of life, actually. Writing historical fiction, World War II history as you do you ever worry that painting with a broad brush, softening the edges with romance, it might diffuse the horror of the time? Do you worry about that?
Well, I don't set out to write romance, although as in the war and as in life, people find themselves in relationships and romantic or emotional situations. But I've always been daunted by the task that I've set out for myself. And so a classic example is when I was writing my first novel, The Commandant's Girl, I saw Band of Brothers, which I think is the finest thing ever put on film. And in episode 8, when they liberate the concentration camp, it's just so stark and gripping. I was paralyzed. And I said, who am I to be writing dinner parties in Krakow when this was going on, 50 kilometers away? And the answer I finally came to was that because these things really were going on 50 kilometers away, and I'm showing another facet of the war. I very seldom go into the concentration camps in my books. The Orphan's Tale may be arguably my darkest book or my most stark story, but I do aim to show different facets and different responses to what was going on during the war.
Well, and let me take that out just a little bit further. In that vein, is there a line that you draw as to how much sepia you'll add to the black and white of the historical data? I mean, is there a responsibility to historical data, fact that you feel as a writer of historical fiction that you can't cross, certain boundaries, certain lines?
Well, it's always a question. I mean, there's first of all the question of historical accuracy, right? So you're trying to get everything true to the time period, where possible, true to, timelines and true to cultures and those sorts of things. Of course, there are always mistakes. I fear there's a mistake in every single one of my books. I'm just not going to say what they are. But so there's historical accuracy, but then I think you're talking about sort of the larger moral responsibility. And I do believe that first of all, that's a question of context and perspective, and it's so complicated depending on whose memory, whose lens we're looking at. And I do believe there were these myriad stories on all different sides going through the war. So I feel that the stories and the narratives I am telling are true to the perspective of a particular person, even though others might not see them as universal.
Okay. You ever get scared when you're writing?
Absolutely. So, The Orphan's Tale, the classic example is the scene of the train of unknown children. I knew from the minute I read that scene that it was going to go into my book, it was going to be important, and it was going to be early. And indeed, it's one of the opening scenes of the book. However, I waited forever to write that scene with a kind of dread, because I felt that in order to do it justice, I was going to have to metaphorically put my own 3 small children on that train, which is an awful, immersive experience to try and write that way. So I wrote it, and then afterwards it was hard to write anything for a while.
And do you ever have to just walk away for a minute and just say, whoop, I can't handle this right this second, let me go away? Or you plow through?
Well, there are times you want to stop and you try and plow through. I'm what I would describe as a short burst writer. So if you gave me 8 hours, I wouldn't know how to write for 8 hours. I don't have the stamina. I do prefer short chunks every single day. So there are times when I walk away for that reason, more because I don't have the stamina. But if you're in the moment and it's going well, you want to try and push through.
So listen to me. You're a wife, a mama. Are you still teaching?
I do. I'm teaching today. I am a law school professor at Rutgers. Which
so you want to tell me, what is this? How do you keep all the balls up in the air, my friend?
I do too many things and none of them well. I joke.
I don't think really, that's true.
There's just so much love in it. I mean, I love being a mom. I adore teaching and I adore writing. And so if I hit Powerball this weekend, not that I played, but if I were to hit Powerball and I won, I would still do all those things. I might slow down a little bit, but there's nothing that I would give up. Is being a part-time writer harder? Yes, I think it's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back compared to people who do it all day. But given how much I love this sort of world I've constructed for myself, it's really worth the stretch.
Why don't you do it all day?
The writing?
Mm-hmm.
I love my teaching. I love my life here. Writing is a very solitary business. And while I enjoy it, I certainly enjoy being part of a wonderful community at my law school, which also, they support me. They are very supportive of what I do with my writing, and I can bring writing to my law school classroom, and it's a wonderful synergy. So, yeah.
Okay, that's a fair answer. I'll take that. I'll buy that. So listen to me, something that you do, and I've always wanted to ask you this, and I never got around to asking you. Here you are, I'm going to ask you this time. Your female characters, even Astrid in The Orphan's Tale, who has a bit of a chip on her shoulder as we first meet her, for good reason, but there it is. I wonder how you do this. You make all of your characters, flaws and all, very likable, extremely engaging. Is there a secret to that? Is that, by the way, the secret to a bestseller? Characters must be, even in their flawed aspects, likable.
Well, clearly, since this is my first bestseller, I clearly don't know the secret, or I would have done this much earlier. But, I think the reason the characters are likable is, number one, there's something in them that we can identify with in ourselves, the flaw, something that's going on with that person that we can identify with. And I don't shy away from the unlikable characters. I like the characters that are messier, perhaps I identify with them myself as well. So that probably has to do with it. But at the end of the day, what I want to do is I want to take my reader, put her in the shoes of my protagonist, and have her ask, what would I have done? So it's not just the character I think the readers identify with, but the circumstances which the character is facing.
So this is just a question I have to ask you. So this is your bestseller. Is this your favorite book, or the one who didn't make it to the top, your favorite book?
Oh, that's like asking me to choose between children.
Yes, of course. Right? That's my job. Choose between children.
Commandant's Girl was my firstborn, so there's always a special place in my heart there. The Orphan's Tale, I think, is on another level, both in terms of the complexity, and the response. So I'm very grateful to that. But all of the books have sort of come together to form part of the journey. And I don't have the time here, but I could tell you why I like each and every single book along the way, if you will.
Well, having read most of your books and followed you along the way and had you on the show through a whole lot of them, I can tell you the difference between this book and the other books. This book really took it all and put it all together. I mean, I just thought this one had such depth to it. It was a real movement for you, a real jump. That's from my point of view. Somebody else might say something else. Do you ever worry that you're going to run out of material?
Not at present. First of all, there's so many stories left, even from the war, just in itself, that to be surprised by a story like The Rescue or Circus after doing this for a decade, those sorts of things just keep coming. And so, I know there's all sorts of stuff percolating out there I'd like to delve into. And then beyond those stories, there are stories of the home front. There are other closely related time periods. So I show no signs of stopping.
Good for all of us. So what is next? Tease us.
I'm working on a project right now. It has to do with some women agents that went missing from Britain in occupied Europe during World War II and what might have happened to them. I'm working on that in fiction form.
What do you mean agents?
Like spies.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure that...
Or women who went into occupied Europe as British spies, never to return.
So when you come to the last page, Pam, when you've written, edited, and I know you have a weird style because you don't write beginning to end, right?
Remember,
I do. Well. I write, but at the end, you do have it's all put together, and you do have to go through that crazy, wacky, long editing process, and then it's the last day, and you say, "This is it, folks. I'm done. Nothing more I can do here." The end. How do you feel?
Nervous, right? Because then I'm sending it off to my editor and I haven't had anyone else read it to that point, right? So there's a lot of nervousness. I mean, obviously there's a lot of relief, there's an exhale, but that's only the first step in the journey because I'm not one of those writers who turns in a perfect manuscript and the editing process is intense. So in a sense, the end is really only just the beginning for me.
Well, from the end to the beginning and to new beginnings. You're always a story. Come back next time when the next book comes out. Look forward to talking to you, kiddo.
Always, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. I've been speaking with Pam Jenoff, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Orphan's Tale. For more information on Pam, where to purchase her book, and when she'll be coming to a city near you, visit her website at pamjenoff.com. You were listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are New York Times bestselling authors of Holocaust fiction, Pam Jenoff and Jessica Shattuck. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
A message from the American Podcast Council.
Hey, everybody, gather around the piano.
All right. Hey, what you listening to? Podcasts. How can I listen to podcasts?
Here, let me show you. real fast.
It's easier than baking a cake.
Well, I should hope so.
Hey, you know there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified 3-part podcast?
Yeah.
That's right. And it seems today, in our troubled world, most people don't know what a podcast is.
No.
It's true, but you know. Got one in your ear right now.
Sure do.
So please, help me out. Show your friends and neighbors how to cast a pod.
Okay.
Then tell the world about your favorite show using hashtag tripod. That's TRYPOD with a capital T and that rhymes with P, and you know what that stands for.
Podcast.
Hashtag tripod. That's TRY pod.
And we are back on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Author Jessica Shattuck's grandparents were Nazis. She admitted the truth in a recent, astonishing New York Times op-ed, "My grandparents were Nazis." She wrote, "It took me until recently to be able to say or even write this." It was when Shattuck came upon a picture of her grandfather in his Nazi uniform that she could no longer deny the truth. She'd been close to her grandparents, in particular her grandmother. Understanding why and how this woman Shattuck knew and loved was swept up in a movement that became synonymous with evil led to Shattuck's writing her gripping new novel, The Woman in the Castle. Turbulent, disturbing, fraught, haunting, The Woman in the Castle provides keen insight into the lives of ordinary Germans during the Nazi era, exposing a perspective rarely examined in the huge amount of literature of the Second World War. How did ordinary Germans experience the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime? And how, in the aftermath, did they reconcile both their acts of resistance and complicity? The New York Times notable author and Penn finalist explores the answers to these questions, as well as the themes of sacrifice, courage, resistance, endurance, female friendship, and the wrenching choices forced upon civilians in wartime in The Woman in the Castle. Let's talk. So, Jessica, this book is so powerful, really. And I think you were born to write this book, I'm telling you. It's such an important, it's true, right? It's an important story. It fits you like a glove. And I want to start at the beginning, which for you seems to have ended in your remarkable piece in the New York Times revealing that your grandparents were Nazis, and the publication of The Woman of the Castle came with that revelation. When did you first learn about your grandparents? And is their truth something you've been walking around with for your life?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think that there are levels of uncovering. And I definitely grew up with a strong sense of shame about being half German. My mother was born in 1943 in Germany, and she grew up on a farm in Westphalia, and I grew up hearing her stories about her childhood. So I was very aware of that time and place being very different than my own. And I was aware of World War II, and I was aware through her of the fact that Germans were responsible for World War II and of the Holocaust. I actually really can't remember a time in my life where I didn't know on some level, in some, not starting out with so much detail, but that I didn't know that the Holocaust had occurred. So I kind of carried that around with me, and I knew that that was connected to my heritage and that my grandparents were, quote unquote, ordinary Germans. And I felt very conflicted about that. But at the same time, I really loved my grandmother, especially. When I was a child, we'd go and visit their farm in Germany, often in the summer, and I loved going there. So I had that kind of conflict seated within me for a long time. Whether I knew they were Nazis is an interesting question. I mean, I knew I had all that sense of shame, but I didn't really put a fine point on it, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid. And then it was when I was more like a teenager going through photo albums with my grandmother. She had a lot of old photos, and she was a great storyteller, and I loved hearing stories and loved hearing about my mom's childhood. And we came across some photos where my grandfather was wearing a Nazi uniform, and it was sort of, that's what we're really talking about here when we talk about these youth groups that you were helping lead. And when I think about my mother's shame at being German and her stress and telling me and telling my siblings kind of what German history was and giving us a full picture of that. So it was kind of a gradual unfolding, and then I had that knowledge for a long time and didn't really know quite what to do with it. I mean, my grandparents were certainly by no means hardcore Nazis. They were not in the center of concentration camps. They were ordinary Germans in that way, but in their case, and in many cases, ordinary meant they had joined the party, and early on they had been really enthused by what Hitler was talking about.
Your grandmother insisted that she didn't know at the time, and this is important to your story as we get into the book. Is that an acceptable answer, or is that an excuse to you? Where are you on that?
Well, where I come out is that knowing is a really big and complicated term, and it's not as simple as did she know, did she not know. It's certainly not an excuse, and I don't think she ever meant it as an excuse. She felt terribly guilty and ashamed of what Germany had done, and that she had been in the party of people who initially had welcomed Hitler's rise to power. And I don't think she was looking to be forgiven. I don't think she was looking to be excused. She was just looking for understanding. And that was a real gift that she gave me, to try to have these conversations and try to explain how she, as somebody who was not anti-Semitic, not racist, not filled with hate, was someone who could have signed on to some of the initial things that Hitler suggested, which had to do with renewing Germany and bringing the economy back to life, getting jobs going.
Gee, it sounds frighteningly, and it sounds like today in a way, right? I mean,
yeah, I think there are parallels.
There are scary parallels. I want to take it here. Something very strange happened. At the very day that I received your book, I was invited to go to listen to somebody speak. Her name is Marion Blumenthal Lazar, and she is one of the last of the Holocaust survivors. Her story, of course, is nothing less than pure horror. I have to tell you, my nerves raw from reading your book. Do we ever find answers? The struggle. And I think that's where I want to take it with you. There's nothing easy here, right, Jessica? Everybody wants to find the black and white. There is no black and white. There's only gray. So I want to talk to you about, from not only your grandmother's perspective, but from history's perspective, your feelings, your heart, the war in your mind, reconciling your grandmother's truth. That had to have been what brought you to write this terrific book, The Woman in the Castle. Yes? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, the personal element of coming at this, trying to understand my own heritage, my own family, was a big inspiration, and in many ways was sort of the foundation for this book.
Let me ask you this. I was going to say inspiration or a psychological or exercise for you to work through some of this? Curious.
Yeah, well, I guess I try not to think of my writing as a psychological exercise for my, I don't want to draw everyone else into my therapy. I can go see a therapist if I want to do that. But, I mean, I'm sure, yes, I think every writer hopefully is drawn to writing about the things that are really interesting and compelling and important to them. And this feels incredibly important to me, trying to comprehend how something as horrific as the Holocaust could have happened, and at the same time holding the knowledge that it happened to real people and it happened by real people, so to speak. Everyone involved was a real human being with a whole complex range of thoughts and emotions, and it's a terrifying thing. I think it's much easier to think of that time as, and the incidents of that time as belonging to kind of a monstrous fairy tale that has nothing to do with us and that we can't relate to. And it's actually in the trying to relate on both ends to what it could have been like to be a victim and to what it could have been like to be a perpetrator, or not, if not at the center. I'm not going so far as to try to imagine what it was like to be a concentration camp guard. In fact, my book has no scenes that are set in concentration camps, but around the edges, the people who were sort of enabling, turning the other way, maybe performing small acts of microaggression. That was really important to me, to try to imagine that.
It's important to write the story of World War II and Nazi Germany from the German perspective, or is it? Because the thought crossed my mind, did you think that by humanizing the Germans or in any way presenting them as sympathetic, it might be a disservice to those who lost their lives or or survived, somebody like a Marion Blumenthal Lazar? There's a moral question that lies at the heart of your exercise. Speak to me about that.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting thing, and I think that's a very alive debate in Germany, even more than here. To me, it's sort of dangerous not to, because then you allow this story to remain in this kind of unrelatable black and white sphere of horrific acts carried out by horrific people, and we don't learn from it. I guess my feeling is that if you can start to see some of the people who enabled the Holocaust to happen as real people, that's where we can learn and we can honor the promise of never again. I think it's hard to really commit to never again if you're just looking at something as a kind of distant horror story.
They say there are two sides to every story. Really, there are at least two. Probably 3, 4, 5, 7, 12,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So in The Woman in the Castle, you have 3 protagonists, and each in their own way, I think, represents your perspective or your grandmother's or any ordinary Germans of the time. Give us an overview of the plot first, and then let's start with Marianne von Lingenfels, who, what a great character you've written in her.
Well, so the story is basically, it begins in June 1945, immediately after the end of the war. And it's about these 3 widows of resistors, men who lost their lives in the failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life of July 20th, 1944. So that was obviously for most people, probably most people know of that because it was a real event, and my characters are fictional, and I've sort of put them into that plot. And these women come together and try to rebuild their lives in this abandoned castle that sort of was once very grand, but is now falling apart and has no running water, no electricity, and they're living in the hillside in Bavaria and trying to sort of regroup and reckon with their past, and ultimately reckon with each other's past, which proves to be in some ways more difficult. So that's kind of the outline of the plot. Do you want me to tell you a little bit about each of the characters?
I do, because I think it's
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah, so Marianne is sort of at the center of it because she is the one who brings the other 2 together, and it's her castle they're coming together in. She is a resistor in her own right, who is a true partner to her husband, and was very much involved in the plot. But as she says, because she was a woman, she's still here. And in the very beginning of the book, when they begin plotting, they're having a big party in the castle, and it turns out to be the night of Kristallnacht, which is something that unfolds as the party is going on. Marianne's husband and many of his colleagues and friends come together in a sort of small room to talk about the horror of what's happening and the fact that they are reading the writing on the wall and realizing they need to take action and want to try to prevent Hitler and the Nazis from staying in power. So it's sort of the very seed of their resistance. And in that conversation, one of them says, well, what about, this is very dangerous. What will happen to our wives and children? Who will speak for them if this fails? And Marianne steps up and says, I will be the commander of widows and orphans. And so the book then, chapter 1, begins at that end, in June 1945, and she's basically honoring that commitment. So she's kind of the moral force and the physical force that brings these other 2 together.
And then there's Benita.
So then there's Benita, and she is very different from Marianne. She's only met Marianne a few times before they come together in this situation. She was married to Marianne's childhood sweetheart / best friend, who was also a sort of dashing member of the resistance. But Benita is from a totally different background. Marianne is kind of aristocratic and very well educated and definitely a member of the German elite. And Benita is is from a really humble origin in an industrial town in Western Germany, and she's not a very political person, and she married Connie because he was kind of her prince in shining armor who was going to rise her out of this fairly, peasantish background that she really is sick of and wants something better for herself. So she ends up actually being very traumatized by the war, and in the end she's sent to prison after Connie is executed, and then in the end she is in Russian-occupied Berlin and facing some of the traumas of being held by the Russians, and she has had it pretty rough, but she's also still kind of not looking at the big picture so much as the world right in front of her and trying to care for her little son and just survive on a day-to-day level. And then there's Anya, who is the most sort of enigmatic and turns out to harbor the most secrets of the three. And she is plucked out of a displaced persons camp by Marianne, who learns of her existence there from the American occupying the lieutenant in charge of the American base near the castle. And she goes and gets Anya and her two sons out of this displaced persons camp where they've come from the east because they were living in what was occupied Poland. And as it turns out, the character has sort of allowed me to explore the opposite end of the political spectrum from Marianne and what it was like to be someone who was an early enthusiast of Nazi policies.
Ordinary Germans, in fact, and that's why I wanted. I thought it was so important to bring that up to set the stage, so that because I really want people to read this very important book. You know, you could have written a book nonfiction, right?
I know a few people have said that, but I'm a fiction writer, so it didn't even occur to me that I would do that, and it was so much more fun to write it as fiction. And certainly it is fiction. I mean, I took a lot of inspiration from real life events and stories and interviews that I did, but my characters are wholly made up, and the way the plot comes together is totally of my own imagination and devising. So it's hard for me to picture how it just would have been a totally different endeavor to write a nonfiction book.
What about the castle? Why did you? There is such a real castle as that castle, isn't there?
No, a couple of people said that. It's funny.
Well, there is on the internet.
Picture.
Yeah.
Von Lingenfels?
Yes, go see.
Well,
my business partner, by the way, is German, lived not too far from there, so that's how I knew that.
Oh, it's spelled differently. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a different, yes. But no, it's not based on that castle. No, I know we actually came across that when I was looking at it. There were a lot of circumstances where I would make up a small town name, and then it would turn out, there is a small town named that in a different part of Germany.
You were meant to write the book.
With the research at the end when it was like,
so nothing there. But it was a plot device.
It's definitely a composite. It's a composite of different castles that I visited in Germany. And its location I specifically kind of chose so that the characters would be able to be, in the American zone, but walking distance to the French occupied zone, and also walking distance to one of the camps in which German prisoners, enemy combatants were held at the end of the war by the Americans. So it's a wholly fictional place in that way, but it certainly draws inspiration from several different castles that I visited and that I researched. There, as everyone knows, Germany is famous for its castles.
It's gorgeous
so
castles. Even those in ruin are beautiful. Yeah. When I was interviewing Marion Blumenthal-Lazan, we talked about the fact that most of us only know or have a picture of Nazis as portrayed in film. That's all most of us know. So I said to her, Achtung, sadistic SS officers, vicious, brutal, cruel, overdone in films? Her answer came without an ounce of hesitation, Jessica. No, that is exactly as it was. In fact, it was far worse. Do you believe in mass hysteria? Is that what Hitler created? Was he the master of propaganda? Does that explain some of it for you? And was that a thought behind in developing your characters? Because you had to have really researched all of this to be able to write the way you did.
Yeah, I think he was definitely a master of, I think he's widely recognized as being a master of propaganda, and he was a genius at exploiting people's fears and whipping people into a frenzy about all sorts of things and using the divisive us versus them, kind of basic trope of human behavior and using that as a vice to really divide and do terrible things.
What does that give you in terms of? I'm sorry, I was going to say, what does that give you in terms of insight into creating your characters and how they responded, the difference and how they responded to what was put before them growing up in that era?
I think that definitely I thought of Marianne as representative of, she's, as a character, she is someone who really recognized the dangers that Hitler posed early, and she recognized and felt a revulsion toward a lot of the Nazi behaviors that other people didn't see, and she was repelled by the focus on Gleichschaltung, like everyone being the same, everyone thinking the same thing and adopting that was something that was very repulsive to her, whereas that wasn't necessarily something that was repulsive to everyone. To some people that's very reassuring appealing. Oh, great! Everyone's going to be kind of alike here, and that makes me feel good, right? So I definitely got to explore how different people related to that, and I think that is it's interesting to think of where that comes from, right? Like, I think about it as a mother. How do I raise children who are going to see evil as it unfolds, if they're ever in that position, who are going to recognize the dangers that are imminent in the moment as opposed to in hindsight? And those are questions that I think we're all trying to answer, and this book gave me some ways to explore that, for sure.
Yeah, the good versus evil thing is so interesting to me because we want to make it simplistic. It's black, it's white, good, evil. You know, the old Westerns, it was always who wore the black hat, who wore the white. That's not true. Right? There is this other thing that kind of gets in the way of that knowing good versus evil, fighting for good versus evil, and that's survival. I was thinking about that when I was reading the book, right? Survival makes you overlook some of that or twist some of that.
I think it can go both ways because survival can also make you accept evil. I mean, the instinct toward survival can drown out all of your moral qualms.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, absolutely. It's instinctual to stay alive.
One thing that it makes me think of is just, and back to your conversation with a Holocaust survivor who is no doubt 100% correct about there being absolutely the cliche of the horrific SS man, being totally accurate. I think that can be true, and at the same time, there are some who don't fit that, right? So that there's, like with almost anything, I think of the Holocaust as having its really dark epicenter where there was horrific behavior and where probably people with serious emotional, psychological problems were able to act out and carry out fantasies that usually civilization keeps in check. That's kind of how I explain some of that really abhorrent horror you read about Dr. Mengele and people like that. But that's not what my book is about. I think we've focused a lot on that, and it's so important that we have focused on that. But I was writing more about those gray areas around the edges where you get what you're talking about, which is kind of that wishy-washy, someone who could do something very bad but can also do something beautiful and good, and someone who can love their child and save their Jewish neighbor, but at the same time betray the butcher down the street and show total indifference to the suffering of, the prisoners being marched through their neighborhood. So
it's such an interesting
that's sort of
thing,
more where my book is set.
But I think you have to know both to see both to get to where yours is, and I think that's why your book so tore me apart. I have to tell you, I'm a mess having read it. I have to. There's a lot of thinking that I need to do, and and not all books leave you that way. So good for you. You got that to do it. But the word that I was going for was sometimes in the survival. It's not a choice. It's an instinct. And we just respond. There is this too. Going back to your grandmother, how do you square your loving grandmother at the end of the day, knowing? And I know she passed away. She lived a good long life and a fruitful one. Look, she produced you, this brilliant writer. How do you do that? How did you wind up squaring it all up for yourself?
I guess I take kind of a complicated view of human nature anyway, so I feel like I've always had the sense that human beings can do really good things and do really terrible things. So to recognize that someone I love would be very deeply flawed is not revolutionary to me. Luckily, I didn't have to square any terrible actions that I know of. I think she was fairly... when I would ask her, like, what did you think when you would see Jews being rounded off and sent off to camps? She said, I didn't see that. I lived in the countryside. And again, I take that with a grain of salt. I think that's an easy excuse, and it's not so clear that people who lived in the countryside didn't ever see something like that. But on the other hand, probability is that she might not have seen it, or it wasn't necessarily right in her face. She certainly wasn't one of the people rounding people up. So I didn't have to square that level of difficulty with my love for her. And I guess I felt like she was really something that I credited her with, was really trying to grapple with her past in a way that many members of her generation, I think, really didn't want to. It was just too hard, or for whatever reason. You talk to most Germans, and and they will tell you that their grandparents don't want to talk about that time. They don't want to explain themselves. They don't want to. They just let it go. And she was not like that. I think she was very brave in wanting to try to address it. And I guess that went a long way in me kind of separating the need to judge and more thinking about trying to understand.
You don't feel a responsibility, do you?
I do, actually. I feel a responsibility to be talking about this time, looking at it, I think it's not helpful that the idea, for instance, that I could say that my grandparents were members of the Nazi Party would be so incredibly shocking even today, when we know that so many Germans were either members of the party or were, actually the membership is not so impressive. I forget what the percentage is, but it's something like 50%. But so many Germans went along with what was going on and were initially enthusiastic. But yet it feels shocking to admit someone you know was like that. And I guess I feel like I feel a kind of responsibility to put it out there, because I hope that we can learn from that kind of honesty, and that, yeah.
Did she forgive herself at the end?
Did she forgive herself? Such a good question. I don't know. And I guess, again, I come to the feeling of like whether our focus on forgiveness sometimes sidelines our ability to understand, because if we get really caught up in, are you forgiven? Do I forgive this person? Do they forgive themselves? It kind of shuts down our ability to explore all the different corners of it. So I don't know. I'm not sure that she would have thought she was in a place to forgive herself. Like, who are we? I mean, that's kind of an existential question, I guess. But who really can offer forgiveness? Victims, I think, and higher force. So I don't know. I'm not sure where she would have come out on that.
I feel such angst about this coming from you. And when I read the piece in the New York Times, I felt the angst, and my heart went out to you. It goes out to anybody who has to deal with, because we all have our crap, right? We're all carrying all sorts of wackadoodle baggage, and, we all have to deal with it and grapple with it at one point in our life. But my last question for you is this, lesson for you, lesson for your gut-wrenching characters. Is redemption possible in all of this? Or something simply unforgivable? I don't know. What do you say? Last answer? Oof. You've been in Germany.
Redemption. I mean, I guess it depends how we mean redemption, right? But I think that in some ways the characters in my book are, in different ways they redeem themselves, in different ways they don't. I think it's not a zero-sum game, but I think that they struggle with figuring out how to make meaning of their lives after the war and how to take responsibility for their actions. And in doing that, hopefully I felt in the end that we revisit them as very old ladies at the very end of the book. And I felt like they were still kind of thinking about these things, but they had also lived lives that were full of meaning.
Listen to me, friend. Those lines on the face that we all learn, they're there for a reason. They're reminders, too, of a life, hard fought, right?
Yeah, it's true, right? We all have to kind of, you can't go back and undo things, so what do you do going forward, I guess, is a question I thought about a lot.
And I always said the wrinkles are a roadmap to the core. Thank you, lady. It's been swell. Fabulous book.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Sure, absolutely. Good luck. I've been speaking with Jessica Shattuck, author of the new, much-talked-about novel, The Woman in the Castle. For more on the book and Jessica Shattuck, visit her website at jessicashattuck.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of RESEC, LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit HalliCasser-Jayne.com.